Smith accosted Neal uh, with an expletive and said, "Whose water are you stealing now?" Neal said, "I'm stealing no one's water. I take no man's water but my own." And Smith then brought the rifle down and shot him, probably killed him instantly.
On the morning of July 5th, 1911, D.S. Neal left his house south of Sorensen Creek in Teton Valley to irrigate his field. His neighbor, Ellington Smith, strapped his Winchester Model 86 to his saddle, mounted his bay horse, rode the short distance to where Neal was working, dismounted, and stepped into the field. He was carrying his rifle, and that begins the story of Neal's murder and the subsequent trial of Smith. That's the premise for a new book by Dan Neal. It's called No Forgiveness, and he's joining us today from his home in Casper, Wyoming. Dan, thanks for taking a few minutes with me today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the chance.
I wanted to note here that before we get into the plot of this book a little bit, you are the grandson of this Neal character in the book, and I would assume that's kind of the reason you wanted to tell this story. Is that correct?
That, that's true. Yeah. You might imagine, this is a story that has been part of my life as long as I can remember. Uh, my grandfather was killed in 1911. Uh, my dad at the time was only 15 months old. So my father never truly knew his father, and but he knew about this tale, and he knew the effect of this murder on his family, his mother, particularly. But when my grandfather was killed, he was married to May Neal. They had five children, all of them under 8 years old. So you can imagine how devastating this would be to a family to have this happen at such a critical point, just when their lives really were taking off. They had just moved to Darby about, oh, 6 years, 5 or 6 years before. We're working to improve a homestead claim. My grandfather was the school teacher at Darby, and by then was also the principal, which I suppose means there was one other teacher. And uh, they their lives were blooming in the Teton Basin, and instead it was shut off by Ellington Smith. And so my goal here was to try to understand how this could happen. I mean, I grew up in Idaho Falls, North Idaho Falls in the 18th Ward. I was around uh, Mormon culture for a long time. As a child, I could not imagine what would prompt one member of a Mormon congregation to kill another.
Hmm.
And beyond that, I mean, these people were neighbors. Smith and Neal lived on opposite sides of a county road. Uh, but that also was part of the source of the problem. There was a small spring there that they both used for water, and Smith claimed that Neal was polluting the water, so Smith could not use it as culinary water, and he claimed that uh, Neal was taking more than his share of the water, which also cut into his irrigation opportunities. So, uh, and the dispute originally, I mean, the murder originally was published as a sort of the shocking end to a feud over water use. So, growing up in the West, we all know how important water is, and we know that people have fought long and hard to ensure their water supplies. Uh, so, I wanted to find out what happened. How could this uh, kind of kind of a tragic event happen in the lives of basically two families? Uh, so that was the motivation for the story. I've been thinking about it my whole life. My grandparents' wedding portrait was hung above the little spinet piano I practiced my piano lessons on for about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years in my early childhood. So I thought about him every day, every time I sat down to practice.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so you mentioned a few things there. We've kind of set the scene here with, this is how this your grandfather was murdered. But we need to go back and kind of explain some of the family history here a little bit. Like you mentioned, you grew up as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Your grandfather was a descendant of a polygamist marriage. Is that right?
That's true. Yeah. In fact, all of the three primary players here all were children of polygamous families. My grandfather uh, had grown up in a polygamous family with three wives in it. My grandmother, her parents were in a polygamous marriage with two wives. And then Ellington Smith also grew up in a polygamous family. I don't know very much about his family history, but I do know he grew up in a polygamous family. So this, you know, I, the fun I had with the book was that I could use this murder as a hinge to try to figure out, okay, so what happened? How did these people really end up in the Teton Valley? What was the effect of this 19th century LDS heritage they had, which we know was uh, a time of great expansion for the church, but also uh, trying to gather Zion into Utah, uh, more people coming in there. Uh, Polygamy gets going strong. They finally acknowledge it in the 1850s. And then uh, the Republican Party is born, bent on eliminating what it called the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. So I got to see how, as that federal pressure ramped up on the polygamists of Utah, I got to see how that affected these people that I never knew, but that you still feel that great attachment to because they're my immediate ancestors.
Hmm. So going, the time that this book is taking place, 1911, by 1911, the practice of polygamy had been abolished. But, this colony of LDS pioneers had settled the Teton Valley, of whom
Right.
your grandfather was a part. And as you set the scene in this book, Ellington Smith and Dan Neal are out in the field and they come head to head. And you mentioned the dispute was over, it was a disagreement about water. But leading up to that, what had caused this feud between them, Ellington and your grandfather?
Right. Well, this was part of the fun of sleuthing this out. I mean, I knew the murder had occurred. I knew the publicly acknowledged cause of it. It just seemed beyond belief to me that that could be really what it was. So as I got into it, I could see they were feuding neighbors. Uh, they the surprise for me, I'd grown up assuming that they'd always lived across the road from one another, but they hadn't. Smith had another farm a couple miles north. He moved to his place after my grandparents were established on theirs. So when he moved in, he understood that this little stream that ran through the property came through the Neal property first, through their barnyard with cows, chickens, pigs. And yet he made a huge thing out of their intentionally polluting my culinary water. There are also a couple of other instances that apparently happened where uh, Smith claimed that he saw my grandfather sort of call his attention and then empty a chamber pot into the stream. There was another claim that my grandfather had washed a workhorse's collar sore out and let it drip into the stream. Uh, Smith saw all this stuff. It was very interesting to me to find out some of these things that were claimed about my grandfather, who I had always been told was this stalwart member of the church and uh, upstanding member of the community. Yet the Smith family, even at trial, made some pretty damning uh, claims about his behavior, and that then became one of the other things I was interested in was to see how the defense was put together to defend Ellington Smith at trial. His trial lasted about 5 days. It was in late January, the first couple of days of February 1912. So trial happened 6 months later, which you would never see happen today. See a murder trial happen within 6 months of a murder. Uh, and the trial attracted something like 700 people. I mean, this is, rural Idaho at the time. There was no, the railroad hadn't even reached Driggs and Victor then. It was in St. Anthony. So there were hundreds of people that attended this trial. They said standing room only, and uh, went on for 5 days. Smith was convicted, but I think because of the good lawyering of the Holdens and the insanity plea, they kept Ellington Smith off the gallows.
You got ahead of me just a little bit. I wanted to backtrack just slightly because we kind of began with the setup for this scene when your
Right,
grandfather was killed. He rides out with his rifle, and your grandfather's out, trying to irrigate. And when Ellington Smith arrives there at the creek, does he just are there words between them, or does he just shoot your grandfather on sight? What played out there?
right. No, this is very interesting. And happily, one of the court documents I found is the transcript of Ellington Smith's hearing, what we would call a preliminary hearing now. It was in the probate court. Ellington Smith's nephew witnessed the shooting. And so he was deposed at this hearing. And so he lays out the whole thing. Ellington comes up, ties his horse, walks across the road, climbs through, and Harry Holden, who was interviewing him, said, "And then what happened?" He said, "Did you watch him?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "Why did you watch him?" He says, "Well," he says, "I thought he was going to shoot a coyote." And he says, "Any man would watch that." And he said, then there, Smith accosted Neal uh, with an expletive and said, "Whose water are you stealing now?" Neal said, "I'm stealing no one's water. I take no man's water but my own." And Smith then brought the rifle down and shot him, probably killed him instantly. First shot, it was a big elk rifle. And then he walked up to within maybe 15 feet and shot him one more time and went back and got on his horse and rode off. And leaving his nephew trying to, process what had happened. There were another neighbors. The murder itself happened about a mile north of the Smith and Neal residences. So right nearly at the mouth of Darby Canyon, if people know the Teton Basin.
How long had this feud between Smith and your grandfather been going on?
I assume it started right after Smith moved in. Smith moved into his house in 1909. My parents had been living there, but my grandparents had been living there about 3 years.
Like you mentioned, it was a 5-day trial in St. Anthony.
Right,
He was convicted, but because of his plea of insanity, did not was not hung. But he did go to the Idaho State Penitentiary.
right. I assume that uh, the jury just was not comfortable sending this guy to the gallows. I think this argument that, well, the victim had it coming, and he may have lost his mind, however briefly, even though you know, if they had accepted the insanity plea, he would have been uh, declared innocent because of insanity. He might have been hospitalized, but he would not have gone to the state penitentiary. But the jury rejected the insanity plea. So I'm trying to thread this little argument here. So they reject the insanity plea, but they still convict him of murder because, you know, the prosecution and the judge made very clear that rage is not an excuse for murder. You
Hmm.
can't just lose your temper. I mean, to be proven insane, you have to completely lose your sense of right and wrong. And the jury wasn't convinced that Smith had.
In a time when, medical knowledge was not what it is today, after you've researched this story and written this book, like if you had to your best guess on maybe what Smith's mental condition was, if you had to diagnose him in today's world.
Well, I mean, at trial, his own family said that his mother had been depressed and she died in a suicide. Uh, they recounted two other incidents where Smith had taken severe blows to the head. Once he was kicked, I think, kicked by a horse and smashed through a corral and hit his head against a building. I mean, he was kicked hard. Uh, so he he'd taken blows to the head. So I can speculate that, like, okay, maybe there was something going on there. He was clearly disturbed. It's a fascinating tell. You get to see how the justice system works. You get to see a little bit about how the state was treating its mentally ill people. Uh, uh, it's great history, and I think particularly people in southeastern Idaho will really enjoy getting a handle on it and seeing the story unwind in places they're familiar with.